The great assembly chamber stretched up toward the stars like a crystal mountain. Ambassador Ji-hoon Park stood alone at the center, surrounded by 47 different alien species. Each one sat in tall galleries that rose in circles around him. The dome above showed the black of space and distant suns, making Ji-hoon feel very small. He wore his simple black diplomatic suit. His hands were steady as he held his old paper notebook. Around him, creatures of glass and light and metal watched with eyes that had seen thousands of years pass by. Some had tentacles instead of arms. Others floated in the air without touching anything. A few looked almost human, but their skin was blue or silver or covered in scales. High Arbiter Kethvar stood at the highest point in the chamber. She was made of living crystal that caught the light from above and threw it around the room in rainbow patterns. When she spoke, her voice filled every corner of the massive space. "Ambassador Park of the human species," she said, "you stand accused of 3 great crimes against the peace of our galaxy." Ji-hoon did not move. He had expected this day for months. "First," Kethvar continued, "you are charged with reckless endangerment of galactic stability. Second, you have violated the sacred protocols of non-interference. Third, you have corrupted primitive species with dangerous ideas." The evidence came next. Screens appeared in the air around Ji-hoon, showing scenes from dozens of worlds. On one screen, creatures that looked like walking trees were breaking chains. On another, small blue beings were standing up to their tall gray masters. A third showed factories falling silent as workers walked away from their posts. "Observe the chaos," said Prosecutor Silthara. She was a whisper being, almost invisible except for a faint outline in the air. Her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. Before human contact, these worlds knew peace. The strong ruled the weak, as nature intended. Trade flowed smoothly. Order was maintained. A delegate from the Veltar hegemony stood up. He was 12 feet tall and covered in black armor. "The humans destroyed our mining operations on 7 worlds," he said. "Our livestock species were content in their roles. Then human diplomats filled their heads with poison words like rights and freedom. Now they refuse to work. Our economy has collapsed." Another voice came from the crystalline Dominion section. "Our perfect harmony stations maintained order for 3,000 years. Every being knew their place and found satisfaction in their work. Human interference has caused emotional chaos. Workers abandon their duties to pursue meaningless activities like art and music." The ancient sage collective spoke through their representative, a floating brain in a glass case. "We have used the dreamer species to power our prediction engines for millennia. They slept peacefully, their dreams serving the greater good. Human questions about consent have awakened them. Now our ability to see the future has been lost." Ji-hoon wrote notes on his paper pad as each species spoke. The aliens pointed at his primitive writing tools and whispered about human backwardness. They did not understand why he used paper when everyone else had computers built into their minds. Silthara moved through the chamber like smoke, her outline growing clearer as she became more passionate. "The pattern is clear," she said. "Humans spread chaos wherever they go. They take species that have accepted their natural roles for thousands of years and corrupt them with impossible dreams. They promise equality where none can exist." She gestured to the screens showing the factory riots and broken chains. "Look at the destruction. These inferior species were happy before human contact. They knew their place in the great order of things. Some beings are born to rule, others to serve. This has been the way since the galaxy was young." More delegates spoke against humanity. The Trade Federation complained about disrupted shipping routes when slave labor was no longer available. The Mining Guild showed profit charts that had crashed after human diplomats convinced their workers to demand payment. Species after species told the same story. Humans had destroyed stable systems that had worked for centuries. The younger species were content, said a representative from the banking consortium. They understood their role as tools for the advancement of superior civilizations. Human ideas of individual worth have made them ungrateful and difficult to manage. Ji-hoon continued writing. Sometimes he looked up at the screens, showing the crimes humanity had committed. He saw faces in the crowds, beings he had met, talked with, learned from. The official reports called them riots and rebellions. Ji-hoon remembered them as conversations and friendships. High Arbiter Kethvar raised her crystal hand for silence. The evidence is substantial, she said. Ambassador Park, these charges carry severe penalties. Humanity could face complete isolation from galactic society. Your species could be forbidden from traveling beyond your own solar system. The chamber fell quiet. 47 species waited to hear what the human would say. Some expected him to beg for mercy. Others thought he would make excuses. A few hoped he would fight back with words, giving them reason to impose even harsher punishment. But Ji-hoon said nothing. He closed his notebook and looked around the chamber. His eyes met those of delegates who had spoken against him. He saw anger there, and fear, and something else. Uncertainty. You will have 3 days to prepare your defense, Kethvar announced. Use them wisely, Ambassador Park. The future of your species depends on what you say when we meet again. The great assembly began to empty. Delegates floated, walked, or slithered toward the exits, talking among themselves about what they had heard. Some seemed satisfied that justice would be served. Others appeared worried about something they could not name. Ji-hoon remained standing at the center of the chamber as it grew quiet. The dome above still showed the stars, but now they seemed less distant. He opened his notebook again and wrote one line. They are afraid, but not of what they think they fear. Then he walked slowly toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the vast empty space. Tomorrow he would begin to show them what they should really be afraid of. The truth they had been hiding from themselves for thousands of years. Ji-hoon sat in his small quarters aboard the human embassy ship. The room was plain compared to the luxury suites other diplomats enjoyed. But he preferred it that way. On his desk lay 3 files that contained the crimes they accused him of committing. He opened the first one and remembered. Nethka had been his second diplomatic mission. The Veltar wanted to sell grain from the planet to human colonies. The price was good, the quality excellent. It should have been a simple trade agreement. But when Ji-hoon arrived on the agricultural world, something felt wrong. The Veltar overseers called the workers agricultural tools. They looked like humans, but with skin that changed colors like a rainbow. The overseers said this was just how they communicated. Simple signals for basic needs. Nothing more than trained animals, they claimed. Ji-hoon watched the workers in the fields for days. Their color patterns seemed too complex for simple communication. When a young worker was taken away, the others flashed the same sequence of deep purple and silver. When food was distributed, different workers showed different patterns, not the uniform response of trained animals. Against protocol, Ji-hoon approached one of the older workers during a rest period. The Veltar overseer protested, but Ji-hoon insisted it was necessary to understand the agricultural process. The old worker's skin shifted to cautious yellow when Ji-hoon sat beside him. "Can you understand my words?" Ji-hoon asked, quietly. The worker's skin exploded in rapid color changes. Surprise, fear, hope, all mixed together. Slowly, carefully, the colors formed a pattern Ji-hoon had never seen before. But somehow, he understood. It meant yes. For 3 weeks, Ji-hoon learned the Tellurian color language. He discovered it was not simple at all. They had words for concepts the Veltar claimed they could not understand. Beauty, love, sorrow, hope. The old worker's name was Bloom of Sorrow, chosen because his colors, when sad, reminded others of flowers losing their petals. "Where are the young ones taken?" Ji-hoon asked one evening. Bloom of Sorrow's skin went dark with grief. The pattern that followed broke Ji-hoon's heart. The young Tellurians were sold to other worlds as breeding stock. Families were torn apart so new agricultural tools could be produced. The Tellurians had watched their children disappear for generations, believing this was simply the way the universe worked. Ji-hoon abandoned the grain deal. Instead, he helped Bloom of Sorrow file a petition with the Galactic Council. He taught the Tellurians about legal rights and sentient being status. The Veltar called it theft and corruption. Ji-hoon called it justice. The second file held records from the Crystalline Dominion's Perfect Harmony project. The space station housed millions of beings from dozens of species, all working in perfect cooperation. No conflicts, no waste, no unhappiness. The Dominion was proud of their achievement and wanted to share their methods with human colonies. Ji-hoon toured the station with Administrator Crystal Song of Order. Everything was beautiful and efficient. Workers moved in synchronized patterns, each perfectly content with their assigned tasks. There were no arguments, no complaints, no disruptions of any kind. But there was also no laughter, no music, no conversation beyond work requirements. Ji-hoon noticed that workers never looked at each other directly. They showed no curiosity about anything outside their duties. When he asked questions about their families or hobbies, they stared at him blankly. "We have achieved perfect order," Crystal Song of Order explained. "Emotional disruptions have been chemically eliminated. Each being experiences satisfaction only when completing their assigned function." "What about choice?" Ji-hoon asked. "Choice leads to conflict. Conflict disrupts harmony." Ji-hoon was assigned a guide, a small blue being called Quickspark, from a species known as Zephyrians. Quickspark's job was to maintain air filtration systems throughout the station. When Ji-hoon asked about his work, Quickspark responded with the standard phrase, "Function completion brings satisfaction." But something in Quickspark's eyes looked different. During breaks, Ji-hoon began talking to him about things beyond work. The stars visible through the station windows, the patterns of light and shadow in the corridors, anything that might spark curiosity. Slowly, carefully, memories began to surface in Quickspark's mind. He remembered a world of tall crystal trees that sang in the wind. He remembered others of his kind creating music with their wing beats. He remembered choosing his own name, not having it assigned by administrators. "They took away our ability to dream," Quickspark whispered one day, his chemical controls weakening. "They said dreams were inefficient." When Quickspark chose to leave his assigned post to help others remember their dreams, the station's perfect order began to collapse. The Dominion called it a plague of dangerous emotions. Ji-hoon called it awakening. The third file was the most recent case, the Sage Collective and their dreamer species. The sages were ancient beings who had learned to predict the future by processing the unconscious thoughts of sleeping species. For 3,000 years, they had kept an entire race in permanent sleep to power their prediction engines. Ji-hoon's mission was supposed to be simple consultation about human sleep patterns. But when he saw the dreamer chambers, thousands of beings floating in tanks, their minds harvested while they slept, he could not stay silent. "Do they consent to this?" he asked Sage Prime Thought. "Consent?" The floating brain seemed confused. "They are asleep. They feel no pain. Krees. Consent. 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 But did they choose to sleep forever? Choice is irrelevant. Their dreams serve the greater good of galactic civilization. Ji-hoon spent hours standing beside the tanks, watching the peaceful faces of the sleeping dreamers. Their thoughts powered everything from weather predictions to economic forecasts. The galaxy depended on their eternal slumber. But no one had ever asked if they wanted to wake up. When Ji-hoon requested permission to speak with one awakened dreamer, the sages refused. When he insisted it was necessary for his report, They reluctantly agreed to wake one for 5 minutes. Her name was Soft Whisper of Tomorrow. Her first words after 3 centuries of sleep were, "I was having the most beautiful dream about flying." "Would you like to fly for real?" Ji-hoon asked. "Am I allowed to want that?" she replied. That question changed everything. The sages had never considered that their sleeping tools might have desires of their own. When Soft Whisper of Tomorrow chose to stay awake and learn about the universe she had only dreamed of, other dreamers began to stir. The great prediction engines fell silent as their power sources chose consciousness over usefulness. Ji-hoon closed the files and looked out his window at the stars. Each crime had begun the same way, with a simple question that no one had thought to ask before. Not, "How can we use these beings?" but "What do these beings want for themselves?" Tomorrow he would face the council again. They would expect him to apologize, to promise that humanity would stop interfering with their perfect order. But Ji-hoon had a different plan. He was going to ask them the same question that had started everything. He opened his notebook and wrote, "The real crime is not what we did. The real crime is what they never bothered to ask." The second day of the trial brought surprises. Ji-hoon walked into the great assembly chamber to find it more crowded than the day before. News of the proceedings had spread across the galaxy overnight. But what shocked the assembled delegates was not the size of the crowd. It was who had come to watch. In the upper galleries, usually reserved for translators and servants, sat beings that had never before been allowed in the council chambers. Tellurians from Nethka, their skin shifting in nervous patterns. Former workers from the Perfect Harmony stations, standing close together for comfort. Even a few dreamers, still adjusting to being awake after centuries of sleep. High Arbiter Kethvar's crystal form seemed dimmer today, as if uncertainty had clouded her usual clarity. "Ambassador Park," she said, "you may now present your defense." Ji-hoon stood up from his chair, but instead of speaking, he did something no defendant had ever done before. He called for witnesses. "I request permission to present testimony from those affected by the actions humanity is accused of," he said. Prosecutor Silthara materialized more solidly than usual, her anger making her outline sharp and clear. "Impossible! These creatures are not qualified to address the council. They are the evidence, not witnesses. If they are sentient beings," Ji-hoon replied calmly, "then they have the right to speak for themselves." The chamber erupted in whispers and arguments. Some delegates demanded that the inferior species be removed immediately. Others pointed out that the Galactic Charter guaranteed speaking rights to all sentient beings. The problem was that no one had ever tested whether the agricultural tools and work units were truly sentient. Kethvar raised her hand for silence. The decision took several minutes of internal consultation with other arbiters. Finally, she spoke. "The council will hear testimony from these individuals, but any disruption will result in immediate removal." Ji-hoon's first witness was Bloom of Sorrow. The elderly Tellurian walked slowly to the center of the chamber, his skin cycling through colors that the translation system struggled to interpret. He had never been in such a large space, surrounded by so many different kinds of beings. "Tell them your story," Ji-hoon said gently. Bloom of Sorrow's skin settled into a pattern of soft blues and greens, the colors of calm determination. When he spoke, his words were translated from color patterns into the common language. "I am 93 seasons old," he began. "For 80 of those seasons, I worked in the grain fields, believing that I was a tool made for farming. My children were taken from me when they reached growing age. I was told this was natural, the way of the universe." His colors shifted to deep purple, the shade of grief. "I watched my daughter, Rainbow of Spring, carried away when she was barely past childhood. I never saw her again. I thought this pain was simply part of being alive, like hunger or tiredness." The chamber was completely silent. Even the delegates who had spoken against humanity the day before were listening intently. Then the human came. Bloom of Sorrow continued. His colors brightened to warm yellows and oranges. He did something no one had ever done before. He asked me what I wanted. Not what I was supposed to do, or what my function was. He asked what I wanted for myself. The Veltar delegate stood up angrily. This creature was content before human interference. It never complained about its role. Bloom of Sorrow's skin flashed with deep red, the color of strong emotion. How can you complain about something when you do not know that anything else is possible? How can you ask for freedom when you do not know the word exists? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The human taught us that we were people, not things. Bloom of Sorrow finished. We were people before you made us into tools. He simply helped us remember. Ji-hoon's second witness was Quick Spark, now calling himself Harmony in Motion after reclaiming his original name. He had grown brighter since leaving the Perfect Harmony station. His blue skin now showing flecks of silver and gold that had been chemically suppressed before. I was happy on the station, he admitted, as he took his place at the center of the chamber. But I had been modified to be incapable of unhappiness. The chemicals in my system made it impossible for me to feel dissatisfaction, longing, or curiosity. Administrator Crystal Song of Order spoke from her gallery. You were satisfied. You completed your functions efficiently. There was no suffering. Quote, but was it really satisfaction? Harmony in Motion asked. When I had no choice but to be satisfied? Is contentment meaningful when you cannot be discontent? The human asked me about my dreams, and I realized I had been modified never to dream. He spread his arms wide, and his skin sparkled with patterns that had never been seen on the Perfect Harmony station. I remember now what my people were like before we were perfected. We made music with our wing beats. We painted with our color changes. We chose our own names based on what we loved most. Those activities served no productive function, Crystal Song of Order protested. No, Harmony in Motion agreed. They served no function except to make us who we were. The human did not give us these dreams. He simply asked why we had given them up. The third witness was Soft Whisper of Tomorrow, the dreamer who had been awakened from centuries of sleep. She moved carefully, still adjusting to having a physical body after so long in the dream state. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear. For 300 years, I slept and dreamed for the good of galactic civilization, she said. My dreams powered your prediction engines, helped you plan your economies, warned you of potential disasters. I served the galaxy well. Sage Prime Thought's voice echoed from his chamber. You served willingly. You felt no pain. Your dreams had great purpose. I served without choice, Soft Whisper of Tomorrow corrected. There is a difference between willing service and service without the possibility of refusal. The human asked me one simple question. Did I consent to eternal sleep? It was the first time in 3 centuries that anyone had asked what I wanted, instead of what I could provide. She looked around the chamber, her eyes taking in the dozens of species that had benefited from her enforced dreams. I do not regret my service. My dreams helped many people. But service given freely has more value than service taken without permission. Prosecutor Silthara attempted to discredit the witnesses. These beings have been corrupted by human contact. They no longer represent their species' true nature. But Harmony in Motion had a ready answer. If learning to value ourselves is corruption, what does that say about the system that required our ignorance? The question silenced the prosecutor completely. Around the chamber, delegates began to whisper nervously among themselves. The moral foundation of their civilization was being questioned in their own halls. Ji-hoon watched as uncertainty spread through the assembly. These were beings who had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years, secure in their belief that some were born to lead and others to serve. Now, for the first time, they were being forced to defend that belief against those who had lived under it. Thank you, he said to his witnesses. You may return to your seats. As the three beings walked back to the upper galleries, Ji-hoon noticed something important. Other members of their species reached out to touch them, to welcome them back. The simple act of speaking their truth had given courage to others who had never dared to hope for more than survival. High Arbiter Kethvar called for a recess. We will reconvene tomorrow for closing arguments, she announced. But Ji-hoon knew that the real trial was just beginning. For the first time in galactic history, those who had been called tools and property had spoken for themselves. The question now was whether the council would listen to what they had said. The third day brought chaos, even before the session began. The Great Assembly Chamber was packed beyond capacity. Delegations from species that had never before been allowed in the council chambers demanded entry. The upper galleries overflowed with beings who had traveled from across the galaxy to witness what many were calling the trial of the age. Security forces struggled to maintain order as arguments broke out between different species. The Veltar delegation tried to prevent Tellurians from entering. Representatives from Perfect Harmony stations blocked former workers from their sections. Even the ancient Sage Collective seemed divided, with some members floating nervously while others maintained their usual cold dignity. High Arbiter Kethvar's crystal form flickered with uncertainty as she called for order. This session will determine the fate of humanity's place in galactic society, she announced. Ambassador Park, you may present your final statement. Ji-hoon stood slowly. His simple black suit, a stark contrast to the elaborate robes and technological enhancements worn by other delegates. He looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of beings who had testified against him and those who had spoken in his defense. Honored delegates, he began. You have accused humanity of 3 crimes: disrupting galactic stability, violating non-interference protocols, and corrupting primitive species. I stand before you today to admit that these charges are true. A murmur of surprise rippled through the chamber. Many had expected him to deny the accusations or make excuses. Human diplomats have indeed caused the collapse of stable systems, Ji-hoon continued. We have disrupted trade routes that functioned smoothly for centuries. We have interfered with internal affairs of other species. And yes, we have given ideas to beings that their rulers preferred to keep ignorant. Prosecutor Silthara solidified with satisfaction, thinking the human was about to surrender. But Ji-hoon was just getting started. However, I ask this assembly to consider one question. When did stability become more valuable than justice? The chamber fell silent. You speak of stable systems, Ji-hoon said, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space. But stability built on suffering is not peace. It is oppression made comfortable for those who benefit from it. He gestured toward the upper galleries where former slaves and workers sat listening. For thousands of years, your civilization has been built on a simple principle. Some beings are born to rule, others to serve. You have convinced yourselves this is natural law, as unchangeable as gravity or the speed of light. The Veltar delegate stood up angrily. It is natural law. Some species are clearly superior to others. Based on what? Ji-hoon asked calmly. Intelligence? The Tellurians created a color language more complex than many species' computer codes. Physical capability? The Zephyrians could build things your finest engineers never dreamed of, before you chemically lobotomized them. Technological advancement? The Dreamers processed more data in their sleep than your greatest supercomputers. He opened his notebook and read from pages of careful research. Every species you have classified as inferior possesses capabilities that match or exceed your own in some area. The only difference is that you had power when first contact was made, and they did not. Administrator Crystal Song of Order's voice rang out coldly. Power creates order. Order prevents chaos. This is the foundation of civilization. No, Ji-hoon replied. Fear creates the need for control. Control creates oppression. And oppression, no matter how stable it appears, always eventually collapses. He moved to the center of the chamber, standing where accused criminals usually pleaded for mercy. Instead, he became a teacher addressing students who had never learned the most basic lesson. "Let me show you something," Ji-hoon said, activating a holographic display. "These are economic reports from every world where humanity has allegedly caused disruption." Charts and graphs filled the air above the chamber. The data showed production levels, innovation rates, and prosperity indices from dozens of planets. Nethka's agricultural output has increased by 40% since the Tellurians gained their freedom, Ji-hoon announced. Not only are they producing more food, but they have developed new farming techniques that 17 other worlds have adopted. The Veltar delegates sputtered protests, but Ji-hoon continued. The former Perfect Harmony stations are now producing art, music, and literature that has enriched cultures across the galaxy. More importantly, their workers are innovating solutions to problems that had stumped your greatest minds for centuries. And the worlds where dreamers have awakened, their populations are learning to solve their own problems instead of relying on predictions. They are building better futures instead of just preparing for predetermined ones. Sage Prime Thought's voice boomed across the chamber. "You have destroyed our ability to prevent disasters. Without the dreamers' predictions, countless lives will be lost." "Perhaps," Ji-hoon acknowledged. "But those lives will be lost by people making their own choices instead of following someone else's dreams. And the lives saved will be saved by people taking responsibility for their own futures." A young delegate from the Aurelius cluster, a species that had joined the council only recently, stood up suddenly. Her voice shook with emotion as she spoke. "Are we here to judge humanity for breaking unjust laws, or are we here to judge ourselves for making those laws in the first place?" The question hit the chamber like a physical blow. Ancient alliances that had stood for millennia began to crack as delegates turned to argue with each other instead of focusing on Ji-hoon. The Veltar delegation stood up and began walking toward the exits, declaring they would not participate in this corruption of proper order. But before they could leave, representatives from 7 agricultural worlds they controlled stood up in the galleries. "We demand representation in this council," shouted a Tellurian whose skin flashed with determined red patterns. "If we are to be judged as property, then at least let us speak as property with opinions." Similar declarations erupted from beings throughout the chamber. Former workers from Harmony stations declared their independence. Dreamers announced they would no longer sleep for anyone's benefit but their own. Species that had been silent for generations suddenly found their voices. In the chaos that followed, Ji-hoon's words rang out clear and strong. "You want to know what humanity's crime really is? We refuse to accept that suffering is inevitable. We refuse to believe that some beings are born to serve others. And if acknowledging the basic dignity of all sentient life makes us criminals in your eyes, then the reckoning starts here." The words echoed through the chamber as the greatest political upheaval in galactic history began to unfold. Delegates who had sat in comfortable superiority for thousands of years suddenly found themselves facing the beings they had oppressed, who were no longer willing to remain silent. High Arbiter Kethvar struggled to maintain control as shouting matches broke out across the chamber. Traditional power structures crumbled as species that had never been allowed to speak began demanding answers to questions that had never been asked. "Order," Kethvar called, her crystal form flashing with desperate light. "We must have order." But Ji-hoon's quiet voice somehow carried above the chaos. "Justice first. Order will follow naturally, when all beings are treated with the dignity they deserve." The chamber fell silent for a moment as every being present realized this was no longer a trial. This had become something much more important, and much more dangerous to the way things had always been. The reckoning had indeed begun. 6 months after the trial that changed everything, Ji-hoon Park walked through the gardens of New Harmony on Nethka. The planet looked nothing like it had during his first visit, where once there had been endless rows of grain worked by silent, color-shifting figures. Now there were communities where Tellurians and other species worked together, their skin patterns creating a constant light show of communication and joy. The trial had never reached a verdict in the traditional sense. Instead, it had transformed into something unprecedented in galactic history. A constitutional convention that lasted for months. The Great Assembly Chamber had become a place where beings who had never been allowed to speak were suddenly writing the laws that would govern their lives. The immediate aftermath had been chaos. The Veltar hegemony had walked out, declaring independence from any council that would listen to agricultural equipment. The crystalline dominion had shattered into dozens of factions, as former Harmony stations declared autonomy. The Sage Collective had split between progressives who supported awakening all dreamers and traditionalists who wanted to maintain the old ways. But from that chaos, something beautiful had emerged. The breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. Soft Whisper of Tomorrow, the awakened dreamer, had offered to share what she had learned during her centuries of unconscious observation. Having processed the thoughts and dreams of countless beings across the galaxy, she possessed unique insights into the nature of different species. The supposed natural order is not natural at all, she had told the assembly. In dreams, all beings share the same fundamental desires: to be safe, to be valued, to have choices, to love, and be loved. The hierarchies you have built are artificial constructs maintained by power, not biological destiny. This revelation had forced even the most traditionalist species to confront an uncomfortable truth. The economic data Ji-hoon had presented earlier suddenly made sense when viewed through this lens. Species performed better when treated as partners rather than tools, not because of human corruption, but because partnership allowed them to contribute their full potential. The solution that emerged was quintessentially human in its approach: compromise paired with uncompromising principle. The new Galactic Charter established universal standards for sentient rights while allowing individual species and worlds to determine their own governance structures within those parameters. The key innovation was the creation of the Dignity Protocols, a set of minimum standards that applied regardless of species, technology level, or traditional roles. No sentient being could be owned, traded, or forced to work without consent. No species could be denied representation in decisions that affected their lives. No individual could be modified against their will to suppress natural, emotional, or intellectual capacities. Most importantly, the new system created the position of advocates for the unrepresented, beings whose job was to travel throughout the galaxy, speaking with those who had no voice and ensuring their rights were protected. Humanity had been given this responsibility not as punishment, but as recognition of their unique tendency to ask uncomfortable questions. It was a role that came with both honor and heavy burden. Human advocates were now stationed on hundreds of worlds, monitoring conditions and reporting violations. They were not rulers or enforcers, but witnesses who ensured that the galaxy could no longer ignore the suffering of its most vulnerable members. Ji-hoon found Bloom of Sorrow tending a garden near the settlement's center. The elderly Tellurian's skin showed the warm colors of contentment as he worked among plants that grew in patterns too beautiful to be merely functional. Ambassador Ji-hoon. Bloom of Sorrow greeted him, his colors shifting to pleased yellow-green. I heard you were visiting our world. What I heard you were visiting our world. What I heard you were visiting our world. Not as an ambassador anymore, Ji-hoon smiled. Just as a friend, checking to see how you are doing. We are doing well, Bloom of Sorrow replied, his skin cycling through patterns that showed satisfaction mixed with determination. Rainbow of Spring returned to us last month. She had been working in the mines of Kethtar 7, but the new protocols required that she be allowed to choose her own path. Ji-hoon felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the planet's twin suns. And what did she choose? She is studying to become a healer, Bloom of Sorrow said, his colors brightening with pride. She says she wants to help others the way you helped us. Not by fixing their problems for them, but by helping them discover they have the power to fix things themselves. They worked together in comfortable silence for a while. Ji-hoon, learning to read the subtle color patterns that indicated different types of soil conditions. The Tellurian agricultural techniques had indeed revolutionized farming across dozens of worlds, proving that innovation came from freedom, not oppression. Do you ever regret it? Bloom of Sorrow asked suddenly, his colors showing curiosity tinged with concern. You could have simply completed your trade agreements and returned home. Instead, you chose to turn the galaxy upside down. Ji-hoon considered the question carefully. The transformation had not been without cost. Several species had left galactic society entirely, rather than accept the new equality requirements. Some worlds had experienced economic disruption as they adjusted to paying fair wages. The Veltar Empire had declared war on 3 former agricultural worlds before other species intervened. But he thought of Quickspark, now calling himself Harmony in Motion, who had sent Ji-hoon a recording of the First Symphony composed on a former Perfect Harmony station. He remembered Soft Whisper of Tomorrow's letter describing the first time she had seen a real sunrise instead of dreaming about one. He recalled the hundreds of messages from beings across the galaxy who were experiencing freedom for the first time. No, Ji-hoon said finally. I do not regret it. We did not come to your galaxy to conquer or to rule. We came to remind everyone of something that had been forgotten. What was that? Bloom of Sorrow asked, though his colors suggested he already knew the answer. That every sentient being has the right to dream, to choose, and to become more than what others expect them to be. As the day ended and Nethka's twin suns set behind the mountains, Ji-hoon received a message on his communicator. It was from the current human advocate on Zephyr Prime, reporting that former Harmony Station workers had just completed construction of their first public art gallery. The message ended with a request for Ji-hoon to attend the opening ceremony. He smiled and began composing his acceptance. There was still much work to do. Justice, he had learned, was not a destination but a journey that required constant vigilance and courage. But for the first time in galactic history, that journey included voices from every corner of sentient civilization. That night, Ji-hoon sat in his quarters aboard his ship and opened his old notebook to make one final entry about the trial that had changed everything. He wrote, "The reckoning was not about judgment, it was about justice. And justice, it turns out, is contagious. Once beings learn they have the right to dignity and choice, they cannot unlearn it. Once they discover they have the power to change their circumstances, they cannot be convinced to return to powerlessness. We did not defeat the old order through force or superior technology. We defeated it by asking one simple question that no one had thought to ask before. What do you want for yourself? The galaxy is still learning how to answer that question. But for the first time in thousands of years, everyone has the right to try." He closed the notebook and looked out at the stars. Knowing that across the galaxy, billions of beings were falling asleep as free individuals, rather than as property or tools. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions to ask, new dignities to defend. But tonight, for the first time since he had first stood in the Great Assembly Chamber, Ji-hoon Park slept peacefully, knowing that the reckoning had been worth it.